Everybody. Today we are going to learn how to do some basic things in Tinkercad. So here I am on the homepage of Tinkercad, my dashboard. You can always return to your dashboard in Tinkercad by clicking the Tinkercad Autodesk logo. Now we're going to start on a brand new design today. So here on the dashboard you can see all the previous designs I have worked on. To create a brand new design, click Create, and we're going to click 3D Design. So this takes us to a blank work plane. The first thing we're going to look at today is placing objects on the work plane. So this is super simple. You are just going to go to the right-hand corner where you have all of your different shapes. If you click the Basic Shapes drop-down menu, there are some other options for you to choose from. But let's say I wish to drag a cylinder onto the work plane. I'll click, and I will simply drag it over. Now I should note that I am using a mouse, so I'm left clicking on my mouse and dragging it over. Now when I click on an object, this box pops up. This is called the dialog box. It tells me that this is now a solid. And then there's also this option called Whole, which means that if I were to have an object selected, and you know that the object is selected because there is a slight blue border, and then also all these little boxes appear. These are called handles. So if I were to click on the object and the dialog box appears, I could make this cylinder into a hole by clicking Hole, and this is useful if I wanted to make a button and put 2 holes in the button. Now, as you're working on Tinkercad, you might need to frequently go back to the dialog box, or the inspector window is also what it's called, and click that button to collapse it, this little arrow. So what I'm going to show you now is how to move the work plane. Now in Tinkercad, we do use a mouse because it is easier to manipulate the work plane with a mouse. So there is this option. This is called the View Cube. And you can look at all the different sides of the object and the work plane by clicking and holding and dragging the view cube. I find it much easier, however, to use the mouse. So on the mouse, I can zoom in with the roller in the center of the mouse. So I'm zooming in here. I can also right-click on the work plane with my mouse and then just drag the mouse around the and doing so will allow me to see the object from all different angles. It does take some manipulating and some getting used to, so you might have to practice before you understand how to get the exact view that you're looking for. Now, Tinkercad gives you a very simple way to know how large the objects that you have on the work plane are. So if I were to zoom in, let me turn the work plane a little bit so you can see it from the top. If I were to zoom in, you can see that there are these larger squares with very, very small squares inside. So each of the larger squares represents 1 centimeter, and the little squares inside represent millimeters. So you would know approximately how large an object is. So for example, if I were to click a cube over and put it on the work plane, I can measure it approximately by looking at the cubes or looking at the squares on the work plane. So this is about 20 millimeters now, or 2 centimeters. So I can approximate, but if I were to click on one of the handles here, these little white boxes, it tells me how large an object is in millimeters. So right now it's 20 millimeters or 2 centimeters. If I wanted to make it 30 millimeters or 3 centimeters, I could just click on the number, type the amount of millimeters I wanted, and then it would automatically change. Okay, so I just changed the length of this cube. Now, speaking of the handles on the work plane, again, the handles are these white and black boxes. So the white handles, if I were to click and drag one of those, the entire shape would change. So notice that it's very inconsistent in how it changes. So all sides change except the top side. However, I'm just going to undo here. This is the undo button. If I were to hold down Shift and click and drag, notice that the object changes sides equally. So each side is changing equally. That's a good thing to know in case you ever need to change the size of an object and you want it to remain equal as it changes. You want each side to remain proportional as they change. There's also the black handles, which change simply one side of the object. Okay. There's also handles on top to change the size. Now again, notice that it tells me how many millimeters my object is on each side. So it seems that from the bottom of the work plane to the top, by clicking on this top handle here, I find that it is 29 millimeters. If I were to click on this one, it's 58.50 millimeters. If I turn it to the side, I'll click this handle, this handle, to find out that this side is 28 millimeters, so on and so forth. So in Tinkercad, you can also copy and paste objects. So if you do want to copy and paste an object, you would click on the object in question, and then you could, on your keyboard, hit Control-C, and then Control-V, and notice I now have a copied cylinder right next to it. I can then click and drag, and there are my two cylinders. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can also create a hole in an object. So let's say I want to cut out a piece of this cylinder. Holes are also useful when you want to cut out pieces of shapes. So if I wanted to do that, I would take this cylinder, I would go to my dialog box or inspector window, and I'm going to click hole. So if I fully collapse it again, so this is the solid and this is the hole. I would then move this. Hang on. So this is kind of what I was talking about when I said that it does take some getting used to manipulating the work plane to get the proper view that you are looking for. Okay, so I'm going to take this cylinder. Okay, I'm going to lock this inspector window because it is in my way and it is annoying. I'm going to put this cylinder in here so that the solid cylinder is inside of the whole cylinder. I'm then going to click outside of the two objects and this dotted red line appears. So I click and hold down my mouse and drag the dotted red line around the two objects like you do when you take a snip of something. Now both objects are selected, and again, you know they're selected because of the blue hue around both objects and the handles that appear. And then I'm going to come up here. So this right here is the group button. So if I click the group button, the two objects are now grouped together, and part of my cylinder is missing because that one cylinder was a hole, and grouping them together has removed part of the other solid cylinder. If I wanted to ungroup two objects, I would click this button here. This is ungroup. So in Tinkercad, I can also rotate objects on the work plane, and I can rotate them from all different sides. So when an object is selected, you'll notice that there are all these curved arrows that appear around the object. So those are the rotation arrows. If I were to click these arrows right here, click and drag with my mouse, see that the object is rotating on the bottom. The bottom of the object is rotating around the work plane. So when I click and drag the rotation arrows, if I go outside here, so if I go on to the larger circle, rotation circle that appears when I click on it, I can more exactly rotate my object to a very specific degree. If you notice, there's the degree that appears right here. So right now I'm moving it by, it's at 0, then 1, then 3, then 4. So it's moving by 1. And here it's moving by a lot more, okay? So just keep that in mind when you're rotating an object. So I can rotate it in that direction. I can also rotate it here. There are also rotation arrows at the top. So if I wanted to flip it this way, I could do that as well. Now, I can also lift objects off of the work plane. That is very simple to do. So I can lift them off of the work plane, and I can also push the objects underneath the work plane. So when an object is selected, this little triangle at the top, if you click and drag it up, it's moving off the work plane. Notice that this number appears at the side. So right now it's at 0, which means that it's level with the work plane. But as I click and start lifting, it's telling me how many millimeters off of the work plane my object is. Okay, so this can be helpful if you want to place one object on top of another object. Okay, also if I were to click it and drag it down, notice that it's telling me how far below the work plane my object now is. And last but not least, I want to point out the snap grid to you. So the snap grid is in the lower right-hand corner. It's right here. So right now the snap grid is set to 1 millimeter, which means if I were to move an object along the work plane, the object is going to move by 1 millimeter. So if you look closely at the small boxes, it's moving by 1 millimeter. Now I can change the snap grid to move by 0.5 millimeters at a time, 0.25, or 0.1. You want to make the snap grid smaller, the number lower, if you're trying to position your object in a very exact way. If you just need to move your object quickly, you could set it to larger than 1 millimeter. You could set it to 2 or 5. So if I were to set it to 5, notice that it's now moving by 5 millimeters at a time. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that while you can, of course, click and drag an object around the work plane, you can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard, which I am currently doing, to move the object around the work plane. This can be helpful to get your object positioned exactly where you need it to be.